From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
You have been working tirelessly for decades to change these prohibitive, draconian policies. And we do know that the conversation has shifted overall, right? At least for some time and in some parts of the U.S. And one thing that we alluded to at the very beginning of our conversation today is the idea that this war on drugs is a war that has serious consequences outside of the U.S. In Psychoactive, you spoke with Juan Manuel Santos, former president of Colombia. And that conversation, I think, is astonishingly eye-opening for a lot of people who only think of this in domestic terms. What do you see other people, residents of other countries, what do you see as their perception of the U.S.'s war on drugs?
Well, I'll tell you, it's evolved over time, Ben. I mean, if you look at the United States, we have been the global champion of the war on drugs from early in the 20th century until more or less the second term of President Obama. It was as if we felt that having embraced the war on drugs in our own country, we needed to proselytize it to everybody else. And we justify it by saying that most of these drugs are being exported from abroad, heroin, cocaine, and much of the marijuana, even much of the methamphetamine. So we got to crack down, protect our borders, blame foreign countries, use carrots and sticks to get them to change their ways in terms of drug production and drug export to the United States. But there was another element. Some element of almost kind of like it almost by forcing others to embrace our way of dealing with drugs, our highly punitive, abstinence-only, prohibitionist war on drugs approach, it was almost like helping to legitimize our own approach in our own eyes. If we get everybody else to do it through persistent pressure, it would somehow make it more legit. And so we played a pivotal role in really, making this a global drug prohibition regime where all sorts of countries which had never even heard of marijuana or never seen cocaine ended up prohibiting them and criminalizing them, not even barely knowing what they were. And then 20, 30 years later, all of a sudden they're having to deal with black markets or their own people using these things through a criminal lens rather than a regulatory health lens, right? I remember back when I got going, late 80s, early 90s, I'd go down to Mexico, Colombia, Peru, you name it. And these countries, they just felt stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, it was clear that the illicit drug markets were essentially global commodities markets, like coffee, like sugar, like tea, like precious metals, like you name it. And that so long as there's a demand, there's going to be a supply. And that there's no way to stop that. And the notion of putting law enforcement officials in charge of trying to stop a dynamic global commodities market just made no sense and was a recipe for creating huge criminal organizations and vast black markets and corruption and violence and all of that, right? On the other hand, they had the U.S. government saying, you better do it our way or we're going to penalize you. We're going to cut off your exports. We're going to send, police and maybe even soldiers. We're going to hurt you in all sorts of ways. So they were really stuck. They were stuck. And I think there was a pivotal moment that happened really, I think after we won the ballot initiatives to legalize marijuana in Colorado and Washington in 2012. And, Obama had previously promised that he wanted to really start to roll back the war on drugs. And he wasn't willing to do it in the first term because they saw it as too politically risky. But once we won in Colorado and Washington, it put the federal government in a tough spot. And at that point, they said, what are we going to do here? It's illegal under federal law, but Colorado and Washington have legalized. So they said, we're going to let those states implement their legalization. And if they can make it work, who are we, the feds, to object? And at that point, that led to a series of events where the United States stopped being the global champion of the war on drugs. We essentially handed off the baton to the Russians, who love being the global champion of the war on drugs. And now Biden, who was probably the least good on the drug issue among all the Democrats in the primaries back in 2020. So he's no great friend of drug policy reform, but even under him, we see, at least some progress where the U.S. is no longer a robust global champion of the war on drugs. Other countries can breathe a bit. The European model, with all of its harm reduction approaches, treating drugs as a health issue, has more chance to flex its muscles and be embraced in other countries. So we are fortunately seeing an evolution in recent years, but I got to tell you, I'm ashamed. I would travel around the world and I'd start off my speeches by saying I want to apologize to you as an American citizen for the harms that our country's war on drugs has done in this country.
Whoa, man. Well, thanks for doing that as our representative. It's very kind of you. I want to talk about where the war on terror meets the war on drugs. In my mind, I first encountered this with Ben, maybe 10 years ago when we made a video on this, Ben, on Afghanistan and the opium trade. And there were just stories coming out about soldiers protecting opium fields. And we had just learned, we had been learning quite a bit at that time just about the military's involvement, with both the war on drugs, fighting the war on drugs, and perhaps a few small groups of people doing some other things with drugs when they're funding, other groups with the sale of drugs and things like that. But when I think back to that time, I have this very clear picture of soldiers protecting poppy fields in the opium trade because it was very valuable both to the people of Afghanistan and for, potentially for the government and the purposes of the military being active in Afghanistan. When you spoke with David Mansfield, my view of that changed quite a bit because of his experiences. I just wonder what your takeaway from that conversation was.
Yeah, well, David Mansfield's, probably the world's leading expert on drugs in Afghanistan. But I'll tell you, Matt, it's a complicated story because essentially, for the United States, fighting drugs has, although it's been a huge thing rhetorically, in reality, it's always been a secondary concern compared to, first of all, fighting communism from the 50s until, the late 90s, early 2000s, and then fighting the war on terror after 2001. Right. And so what would happen is that and there's a wonderful book about this by a University of Wisconsin professor, Alfred McCoy, called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which sets the context for your question about Afghanistan, which is that what would happen is go back to Southeast Asia. There, the United States was fighting in the 60s and early 70s. We were fighting against communist guerrillas in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, what have you. And many of our allies there were these other, indigenous, tribes and other organizations that were anti-communist. And sometimes the best anti-communist fighters, right, were the people who were also involved in the illicit drug activity. And so what happened in Southeast Asia is that, the CIA, oftentimes, sometimes the military, more often the CIA, they would be shipping weapons up to our anti-communist allies in parts of Laos, Vietnam, what have you. And then when those planes came back filled with opium or heroin to Saigon to be exported to the U.S. and other parts around the world, well, U.S. intelligence would just turn a blind eye to that. Right? Because the greater objective was fighting communism. Same thing happened in, Central America. The Contras back in the 80s, right? Once again, fighting the communists. So when our Contra allies would get involved in drugs to help fund their activities, the CIA, sometimes the DEA would be going after those guys and the CIA would intervene and say, wait a second, those drug traffickers, they're the best allies we have in fighting the communists. And this would even happen in small... Exactly. And this would even happen in smaller ways going on in, parts of Latin America, South America, and Afghanistan, of course, was the great example of that. Because, when the Taliban were first in power in the late 90s, early 2000s, our greatest ally in fighting the communists was deeply implicated in the opium trade, in the heroin trade, the guy who was assassinated by the Taliban right before 9/11. And so it was once again kind of saying, hey, we got priorities here. Now, part of one consequence of this, is that you would have some people in the United States, especially black politicians, Maxine Waters from California and others, who would say, the reason we have a drug problem in America is because of the CIA. They're sending crack cocaine into our ghettos, or decades ago, they're sending heroin into our ghettos. And what I would point out to them is, yes, the CIA is complicit. It is true. But even if the CIA had been squeaky clean, crack cocaine would have shown up just a few months later in Los Angeles, in New York, or what have you, or heroin would have shown up just away, because ultimately these are global commodities markets, and any role the CIA is playing with our, anti-communist or anti-terrorist allies in Afghanistan or Vietnam or Mexico through the years, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the bigger dynamics at play here. So it's always been a complicated story. It doesn't justify the U.S. being involved and being complicit in drug trafficking, but I think it's important to put it into that context there.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and one that needs to be brought up more often. The sad reality often seems to be that people, when hearing a narrative, want an easy, cut and dried story of villains and heroes, rather than the much more realistic story of competing and sometimes complementary interest, right? The old strange bedfellows situations that occur so often in the world of geopolitics. This leads us to one of the questions I'm very excited to ask you, as the world's foremost expert on drug policy. We've entered the realm of a little bit of myth busting, because we know that the story of drugs in the U.S. is often riddled with alarming accusations, right? With conspiracy theories. We've already mentioned two of the most popular: the idea that the CIA purposely flooded disadvantaged neighborhoods with cocaine, sort of steepling their fingers, Monty Burns style, the whole time. And with this in mind, we have to ask, are any of the conspiratorial things people hear about drugs and prohibition, do any of them, in your opinion, have some sand? I'm thinking particularly about accusations for profit motivations, which you mentioned. I think also one of the big ones that we've yet to address is the possible role of legal drug manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, the Purdue's, the Sackler family kind of operations. Do they, I guess what I'm asking is, Ethan, is any of that real? Like the accusations that Big Pharma is quote unquote doing this.
I mean, Ben, I'll tell you, it's complicated, right? So let's just take Big Pharma as one example, and then I'll turn to another. Back in the late 80s, an organization emerged called the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, and they were obsessed about marijuana use among young people. Now, interestingly, in their early years, they were funded by big alcohol, big tobacco, and big pharma. Right? Now, ultimately, they were embarrassed to stop taking money from big alcohol and big tobacco. And the guy who was the head of that organization was a fellow named Jim Burke, who had been was the head of Johnson & Johnson, the famous pharmaceutical company, who was a hero. He was when they went through a little scandal with this tainted Tylenol killing people, the way he handled that, his crisis management, that became a role model that they would teach in Harvard Business School for how to deal with crisis management. So he was one of the most powerful people in America, in the corporate world and in that kind of, WASP establishment in America. But he was, head of the Partnership for Drug-Free America, the chair of it. And it seemed to be all about demonizing marijuana because, if you Googled, or you couldn't Google back then, late 80s, early 90s, but if you looked around on drugs, what would pop up is drugs meant heroin, cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, LSD, but drugs also meant everything Big Pharma was producing. And so they had a kind of marketing issue, which how do we distinguish our good drugs, our okay drugs from those bad drugs? So the Partnership for Drug-Free America became entirely focused on marijuana. They entirely ignored the issues with pharmaceuticals. pharmaceutical problems. They downplayed the issues with alcohol, at least in their earlier years. Right. So you had that part, Now, I didn't see them putting big money. I mean, they never actually put big money into opposing our marijuana legalization initiatives, but they would get involved in trying to figure out, how do we slow the pace of this reform here? Now you move forward to the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma, which became notorious for its, grossly inappropriate promotion of OxyContin. OxyContin was a new formulation of an opioid that was a miracle drug for people struggling with pain, but when it's marketed to people with chronic pain, created a big problem. And I interviewed both the author of the book Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden Keefe, about his book about the Sackler family, but also Kate Nicholson, who started an organization, to represent the interests of people who are using pain medications, pharmaceutical opioids responsibly, but now can't get them anymore because doctors are afraid to prescribe them because the pendulum has swung so far the other direction. And so there, what I say is, the Sackler family, and especially, the key people involved with Purdue Pharma and that organization, they deserve the blame they're getting. They deserve to be punished, put out of business, penalized, maybe even go to jail. They deserve that because of their gross overpromotion of this stuff. But as you said, Ben, people want to have the easy enemy. So all of a sudden, the Sacklers Purdue Pharma represents the entire face of the opioid epidemic. But in point of fact, they have not been a major part of the problem for the last 10 or 15 years. The problem then became heroin, and now it's about fentanyl being imported illegally from China and Mexico. And then, so there's a kind of gross distortion. So the Sacklers who deserve 20% of the blame, or Purdue Pharma, are being given 90% of the blame, and that distracts us from what's really going on. And then I'll just point out one other example. There is probably no more demonized and appropriately demonized force out there in the kind of global capitalist world than big tobacco, right? Those fuckers lied, cheated, sold their cancer sticks, addicted teenagers, came up with more addictive cigarettes. You name it, right? So, absolutely a despicable business that, basically ends up killing their most loyal consumers, right? After making a huge amount of money from them. But now we're this interesting moment where some of the big tobacco companies are getting deeply involved in developing e-cigarettes and these what are called these heat not burn devices. Well, it turns out these are ways of consuming nicotine that present a tiny fraction of the risks of cigarettes. In fact, if you could snap your fingers, and tomorrow the 40 million Americans who smoke cigarettes, or the billion plus people around the world who smoke cigarettes, were to suddenly stop smoking cigarettes, and every single one of them were to start vaping and using e-cigarettes or juuling or whatever, it would be one of the greatest advances in public health history, in the history of the world. And that would even be true if far more young people were vaping, than had been smoking. But most Americans don't know that. So big tobacco's become a very complicated figure where they're still selling their cancer sticks, they're still making money there, but some of them are trying to make a real transition to selling nicotine in far, far dramatically less dangerous forms. But once again, our need for simple answers and simple enemies is standing in the way of an effective public health approach.
Simple answers and simple enemies. Yeah. It describes so much of what we cover on this show. You're making me think about propaganda. I crafted this question. I'm going to ask it the way I wrote it out just because I was kind of proud of it, Ethan. But it's basically what you've already said. I want to see if you got a different answer when it comes out this way. While there are several ways to affect the laws governing this democratic republic, in my opinion, the second most effective maneuver is to change the way a majority of the voting populace thinks. So, for better or for worse, that means deploying some form of propaganda, at least to my mind. Over the course of your career, how have you seen propaganda most effectively deployed from both sides of the war on drugs?
Well, that's a great question, Matt. When I look at the propaganda on the drug war side, they were just extraordinarily successful in the 80s and 90s. They managed to take an innocuous substance like marijuana, not totally innocuous. People can get addicted to it. People can have problems with it. So, I know people have had serious marijuana problems. But the vast majority don't. And for the vast majority, it's probably a net positive in their lives, right? Mm-hmm. But somehow Nancy Reagan gets up there with her "just say no" and saying the most dangerous drug user in America is a teenage marijuana smoker who's doing well in school, basically, because they send the wrong message to everybody else. So their propaganda, the ones who believed in, instituting a system of mass incarceration and blaming everything on drugs. Their success in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, I think a lot of people are now in their teens and 20s don't even appreciate how venal and effective that campaign was. It would literally be if you took 10 scientific questions about drugs, about the relative risks or about what happened or this and that, and you asked ordinary Americans, they would get the majority of the answers wrong simply because the media was and the media, everybody, it was just everything they believed was basically false. Right? That you use a drug once, you become instantly addicted. False for the 99.9% of all people. Opiates, the fact that if you have a legal, secure supply of heroin, you can consume that and live to be 90 years old and hold a job, right? It's more about black market heroin and adulterated heroin. People didn't know that. Marijuana does these things to your body. LSD, harms your chromosomes. MDMA drains your spinal fluid. These were front page news stories where people would get freaked out about this stuff, and it was all bullshit. Or 99 or 90% bullshit, that marijuana is a stepping stone, to getting in trouble with other drugs. Well, I describe that as an ounce of truth embedded in a pound of bullshit. Right. And now we're seeing the same misinformation around the issues of vaping nicotine as opposed to cigarettes, where a majority of Americans believe that e-cigarettes and vaping is as or more dangerous than smoking cigarettes, when it's diametrically opposite, in which a majority of doctors believe that nicotine is what causes cancer, when nicotine doesn't cause cancer. It's the combustible elements of the cigarette that cause cancer, right? So their propaganda, both then and now the modern day stuff that we're seeing around vaping and even somewhat around the role of opioids in pain management, it's just horrific propaganda that helps explain a big part of the American war on drugs and why we've had such a problem, not just with mass incarceration, but why we have 100,000 people dying of overdoses today. Now, if you ask on our side, where have we been most successful? Hey, man, we don't do propaganda. We're just all about the evidence, about the science. But I'll tell you this. I think, there was one of the things we did that I think was very effective was that we were smart about our messaging. Already almost 25 years ago, we did some focus groups and public opinion testing, and we realized that most Americans, the word legalized to them meant something being out of control. Whereas when we meant legalization, we meant regulation. And we realized that using the phrase of tax, control, regulate, and educate was the way to reassure people in the middle that what legalization was a responsible regulatory approach. And then, I remember, back in, this is about 10 years ago, different groups, my organization, other organizations, we each had sometimes different views about what would be the most powerful message. Some people said that it's about personal freedom. Some people said it's about marijuana being safer than alcohol. Some people said it's about the medical value, right? But what we all agreed on was that say whatever you want to say, but come Labor Day, 2 months before Election Day, when we were going to have an initiative on the ballot, we would all stop our own favored messaging, and we would rely on the messaging that the polling told us was going to work best to persuade the fearful soccer mom, the person in the middle, right? The American parent who maybe used marijuana when they're younger, who was kind of scared, but knew marijuana prohibition didn't work. And those two messages were, hey, we'd rather have the cops focusing on real crime instead of going after young people for marijuana. And we'd rather have the government taxing and regulating this stuff instead of giving all the money to the gangsters. And that message discipline, which was, true in most states, really helped us move forward. Now, we're in this little kind of sweet spot right now where there's remarkably little negative stuff coming out about marijuana. It's almost as if it's, with the mass commercialization, with marijuana emerging in liquid forms and chocolate forms and this and that, and the medical value being more and more appreciated. But we're in this period where I see it beginning to swell up now, where we're going to see the pendulum begin to swing and people are going to start talking about the harms of marijuana again and the dangers of marijuana and bringing back both some of the science, which is true about some risks of marijuana, but also some of the propaganda. It's why I was very reassured when just recently the annual survey of drug use came out, and it showed that marijuana use among adolescents dropped more last year than almost any year in decades. So notwithstanding the broad legalization and commercialization, and notwithstanding the fact that marijuana use among people my age is increasing dramatically, marijuana use among adolescents keeps dropping. So as long as that stays the case, I think we're in a sweet spot. But at some point, because this goes up and down, irrespective of public policy, adolescents are going to get into weed again, and we're going to see an increase, and then we'll see the anti-drug propaganda reemerging.
Yes,
thank you, Ethan.
save the children. That's a heck of an effective message, right? Regardless.
Well, right. I mean, so often the entire war on drugs has been justified as one great big Child Protection Act. And now when we look at the opposition to e-cigarettes, right, where we know that, smokers in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s switching to e-cigarettes could dramatically, cut, tobacco-related deaths. But hey, what about the kids? They've been juuling. They've been doing this stuff. And even though the risks to them are dramatically less than the harms to adult smokers, hey, man, it's all about the kids. If 1 million adults got to die prematurely so that we can keep a bunch of kids from vaping, hey, that's a price worth paying. So we're seeing the old drug war rhetoric now connecting to these issues around tobacco, vaping, and cigarettes.